Sometimes you make a movie because of a sentence that you hear. In Apocalypse Now, the sentence that made me make that whole movie, and pardon my bad language, is I read a quote where a general or someone says, "We teach the boys to drop fire on people, but won't let them write the word fuck on their airplanes because it's immoral." I said, that's Apocalypse Now.
I wanted to start with the Catalan conspiracy because it's such a fascinating thing to me that I feel like very few people know about, but was arguably one of the most famous events in Roman history. And, the founders were all intimately familiar with it many centuries later, but it's been largely forgotten today.
Well, it has to do, I think, with the nature of history is that it very often is twisted by whoever the victor was to make it turn out in a prepared way. And the Catalan conspiracy, there are a number of accounts. The most famous one is Sallust, I think, but also Suetonius talks about it and presents it in a different light. So these historical events really are based on interpretation having to do with who ended up with the power to write the history. Are you familiar with this lady? I think she's still living, Mary Beard, who's sort of one of the, yeah. Well, I had at one point asked her to read my rough script, which was, you could say was taking America as a historical counterpart of Rome, because we were founded on Roman ideas. And my original idea, what if the Catalan conspiracy was something between Mayor Koch and Walter Gropius, who was architect who had come to America. That was how it was beginning to emerge in my mind. Mary Beard said something to me very interesting. She said, the most successful Roman adaptations were done by George Bernard Shaw because he took great liberties. In other words, he sort of, like in his famous Caesar and Cleopatra, he just made it up, based on what he thought made sense. And so she suggested I take many more, that I was trying to follow the history a little too carefully. And she advised I took more liberties. And she said, read the Suetonius account of the Catalan conspiracy, because in it, young Caesar had more to do with it than history knows. And as he was the young Caesar, as at the age he was really an accomplice of Sergius Catiline. And that's when she said, you can even call the character Caesar because, frankly, she said, when you give this out to people, they don't know who the hell Sergius Catiline was, but everyone knows who Caesar was.
Sure. So
I took her advice and I did a draft where I sort of just was more free with what I was saying. And of course, just to shut up for a minute, but, if it was, since it was ultimately in the Catalan conspiracy, it was Catiline who survived. He sort of wrote the history.
Cicero, you mean?
Yeah. Just like with Cleopatra, Augustus writes the history and made Cleopatra be this sexy seductress, but in truth, Cleopatra was a genius.
Yes.
But she doesn't get credit for it because no one on her side, wrote the history. So I rewrote it according to this suggestion, and I made Caesar more the way he appears in the movie. But that was taking great liberties with history, as you know.
It's sort of a prequel to the most famous event in history, which is sort of Rome's civil war and the assassination of Caesar, because you got all the main characters. You've got Caesar, you've got Cicero, you've got Cato,
got Crassus.
Crassus, and then of course Catiline, and we've just sort of forgotten all about these sort of preceding events. One of my favorite books is this book called "The Storm Before the Storm," and the idea is that we kind of just see Caesar crossing the Rubicon one day as if it just popped into his head, as if there wasn't all this history and all these other events leading up to this other major event.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm going to get that book. So thanks for the recommendation.
Yeah, you could argue, though, I think your point about it comes down to who tells the story. Catiline's biggest mistake, aside from, trying to lead an insurrection, is that he attempts to lead an insurrection when the government is led by Rome's greatest writer and speaker. That was a fatal error right there.
Also, history tends to ignore some other events that had happened before, which is the whole period of, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Sulla.
Mm-hmm.
And who is there was another general after Sulla.
Marius.
And that was a very traumatic period of Roman history, and with the Sulla proscriptions. Mm-hmm. and what went on. And Catalina, Sergius Catalina, actually was an errant general or a participant with Sulla, which, of course, most people today know nothing about. They talk about, Caesar. When they make the comparison of what's going on in America today, they don't allow that there was a terrible period of Sulla and proscriptions, and whoever you declared was a traitor, you got all his property.
Yeah.
So there's a lot about Roman history that isn't commonly known. I mean, obviously, and at our time of our founding, of course, any intelligent young man had Latin training, so they knew a lot more than we know today, I think.
Yeah, I was so struck by rereading some American history, and when Aaron Burr sort of comes onto the scene, he is like universally referred to by all the other founders as a kind of modern Catalan.
Yeah.
And they would have known, your average person, when they heard that insult, would have known what that meant. Whereas today, if you called some modern political figure a Catalan, people would be like, what are you talking about?
Had you, by the way, ever read Gore Vidal's book on Aaron Burr?
No.
That's another great book. Vidal was a brilliant, for all his other complications, he was a great scholar, and he wrote a beautiful book on Aaron Burr, and also on who's the first Christian emperor?
Constantine?
Yeah, well, a lot of what I learned from Gore Vidal.
Interesting. So have you always loved Roman history?
Well, I didn't. I was a very poor student. In fact, I was such a bad student, but partly because my father was always moving, and I was always the new kid in school. And I used to get, in those days, if you had a bad report card, which I got every term, you'd get a beating. I got a beating from my father with a strap. And he said to me once, I remember, if you don't get better grades, I wasn't smart enough to say, but Dad, you take me out of school every 6 months, which was my defense. But he always would threaten me. He said, if you don't get better grades, I'm going to send you to a Jesuit school where you get a beating if you don't get grades. And boy, do I wish I had been sent to a Jesuit school, because I would know Latin and Greek.
Yes.
And what a gift that would have been if I could read Latin and Greek, which you got in a Jesuit school, if you went to one of those. So my sadness is I was a bad student. I couldn't do anything that I really had. I wanted to be a scientist. My father said, you cannot fail algebra twice in a row and be a scientist. So,
did Roman history seem part of your heritage as an Italian? I'd just be curious. Like, I see it as sort of just the ancient world. I'm not seeing this sort of, I don't see it as so much as a place, right? I see the Roman Empire. I'm not thinking Italy, but I'm just curious what your perspective is.
Well, as a kid, I remember my name is Francis, but I was really named after my grandfather, Francesco. And when I was a kid, being an Italian was sort of like there were certain neighborhoods you couldn't move into. And my parents didn't teach us the language. and gave us anglicized name. My brother was Augustino, but we called him August, Augie, and I was Francis. And that was to avoid this, that we were low-class Italians. We couldn't move in the neighborhood. But my mother always said, oh, but you're an American, and America is the greatest country in the world. But my father would say, but you're also Italian. And the Italians contributed to all the great literature and music and opera and classicism. And of course, I was born in 1939, so this is when World War II was going on.
Yeah.
And the Italians were allied with the Germans.
Not the good guys.
Yeah. But, interesting thing, which I'm sure you know, is that the figure who really went back to ancient Rome and sort of resurrected fascism was D'Annunzio, the poet. And he was the one, because he was a brilliant, he knew about history. And Mussolini, who was a journalist, was imitating D'Annunzio with all the Heil and all that stuff. And Hitler was imitating Mussolini. So it really goes back to an Italian poet, Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was who resurrected the fascist idea as it existed in modern world wars.
Yeah, there's always been this battle to sort of say who owns these stories, who, not just who tells the story, but then who owns the figures and who gets to claim to be a descendant of them. And then, yeah, art has been this process of writing and rewriting and retelling these stories from different perspectives. What is your ultimate read then on the Catalan conspiracy? I tend not to love Cicero. Of all the sort of ancients, I find the more I read about Cicero, the less I like him. He seems kind of obnoxious and annoying.
Yeah, no, there's no question. I mean, the reason he emerged in my mind is because the famous anti-Catalan speech is something every Latin schoolboy knows.
Yes.
And so I wanted to get that in my movie word for word, which I did. Have you seen my movie yet?
No, I haven't seen it yet. I'm very excited. But Eddie told me all about it.
We have to show it to you. It's pretty weird. I mean, it's very definitely unusual. And it probably does more of what I wanted to do than I realized.
Interesting.
Because, when you're making an unusual movie, or a movie you don't know how to make, which is usually what I find myself doing, the movie starts making itself, and you start following, you start saying, well, let's do more of that and less of that.
Yeah.
And little by little, the movie is, if you know what you're doing, then you just do what you know how to do. But if you don't know what you're doing, which was when I made Apocalypse Now, I had no idea what I was doing. And Megalopolis, I had no idea what I was doing. So little by little, I was following what the film was suggesting. And we would look at the stuff, all of the collaborators, and we'd see some really weird stuff that we had shot to get going, and we'd say, let's do more of that.
So there's kind of an emergent property when you're following a story?
Yeah, you and the collaborator, first of all, as you know, theater and cinema is a collaborative art.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not one guy sitting alone writing a book. It's a team of people who are creatively collaborating together, which is a thrilling. I've often said that collaboration is the sex of creativity, because to work with a dozen other people who are talented in maybe specific fields, but all of you together are coming together to make this group art, which is what theater is. Why it's a group that you belong to, and of course, as the director, you're sort of the ringleader, perhaps, but you're really also a follower of what the actors are doing, what the composer is doing, what the visual artists are doing. So it's a very exciting project. But you sit together and you evaluate what you're getting, and the process of when you say, let's do more of that and less of that, is the film telling you how to make it. In other words, you as a group are recognized, like in Apocalypse. Did you ever see Apocalypse Now?
Of course.
There's a scene in Apocalypse Now where all the boys are on the boat and they're all stoned, and they're setting off smoke grenades on the boat, red ones and blue ones. Well, smoke grenades, the purpose of smoke grenades, why they're colored, is on land, if there's a safe place for the helicopter to come down, or an unsafe place, and don't land here, you set off a red smoke grenade. And if it's a safe place, it might be a blue, or if it's yellow, it's be careful. So smoke grenades are like a code, but on the boat, there's no purpose for a smoke grenade. They would have them because when they got on land, they might need them. But the boys were just sending off the smoke grenades in the wind, and because they were stoned, and it was beautiful. So we all saw that in the dailies, and we said, let's do more of that. Let's do more of that. And little by little, Apocalypse Now started to become more surreal.
Yeah.
And that's how the movie is leading you. And in fact, when I got to the end of Apocalypse Now, I had no idea how to end it because it had become so surreal that the ending, which was a typical big battle scene ending, was no longer appropriate. And Brando, who was such a smart guy, a brilliant man, said to me, "Oh, you've painted yourself in a corner, haven't you?" He realized that I had taken the film so far off into the surreal that a normal ending wouldn't work. Well, the same thing happened with Megalopolis. As we looked at it together, we collaborators, and there was a lot of weird stuff I do just to get going, to sort of, you do the first few takes and you might do some unusual things to sort of spur everyone's creativity. And then the later takes get more and more normal. Well, we started saying we all liked the early takes, which were the weirder ones. Said, well, let's do more of that. And it's that let's do more of that and let's do less of that starts to determine how the movie gets made.
Well, let's talk about the oration real fast. I have a chunk of it here. When, O Catiline, do you mean to cease abusing our patience? How long is that madness of yours still to mock us? When is there an end of that unbridled audacity of yours, swaggering about as it does now? Shame on the age and its principles. It's just so amazing. Whether it was fully deserved or not, you can't argue with the brilliance of Cicero.
No, and it was that speech that was my hook. I said, can you imagine being in New York and having Mayor Koch saying that to Robert Moses?
Sure. Yeah.
That was in a nutshell. Sometimes you make a movie because of a sentence that you hear. In Apocalypse Now, the sentence that made me make that whole movie, and pardon my bad language, is I read a quote where a general or someone says, "We teach the boys to drop fire on people, but won't let them write the word fuck on their airplanes because it's immoral." I said, that's Apocalypse Now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes it's just one sentence. And so this Catiline oration, which was in Latin, and every schoolboy in America, every schoolboy knows that. I said, what if I could do that? And that led to the whole movie.
Yeah, it is kind of amazing. I've been talking about this, whether or not you actually needed to learn Latin or Greek these days. The magic was the way they taught it for so many hundreds of years was that you had to repeat these magnificent sentences and epigrams and ideas that were kind of seeping in.
By rote, over and over.
But when I learned Spanish in high school, it was like, where do you want to go to lunch? Where do you live? What are your parents' names?
Where is the post office?
Yeah. Yeah, ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? You're not learning the greatest turns of phrase ever coined by human beings. And I wonder if that's why languages are so uninteresting to most school kids.
Well, the schoolboys in our founding of our nation were reading Caesar, the Gallic Wars, the whole thing.
Yeah.
They knew it by heart.
Yeah, Washington was the only founder who hadn't read the classics in Greek or Latin. He was considered not as smart because he only read them in English. Only in English.
Right, and Jefferson, on the contrary.
Yes.
But Jefferson was not a Stoic. Jefferson was an Epicurean.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you know much about Epicurus? You've given me such good tips. I feel that this kind of conversation, I owe you a few good ones.
Tell me about Epicurus. I know a bit about him. I think he also gets a bad rap.
Yeah, he gets a very bad rap because Epicurus did not believe in life after death. Part of the Epicurean philosophy is he talks a lot about it in a beautiful way. He says, where there's life, when death comes, you don't exist.
Yes.
The Catholics had their biggest business was the paying of, what do you call them?
Indulgences.
What is that called? Indulgences. Yeah. So the Catholics basically wanted to bury Epicurus, whose philosophy was much different than people. People think Epicureanism is to be fat and just go to feasts and eat. That's not at all what he was about. But anything of Epicurus, or even a Roman poem that was about Epicurus, was banned and disappeared. And it only turned up in the 14th century in some monk's library for the reason you said, is because just like people used to have to recite it over and over again, they used to have to just copy the text down over and over again to practice. There's a wonderful book that I recommend to you that you'll thank me a million times that it's a good read. It's called The Swerve. Have you ever heard of it?
Yes. Incredible book.
Oh, you read it?
Yes. Stephen Greenblatt is a treasure.
Yeah, he wrote. He's a Shakespearean scholar, but he wrote The Swerve, and it was an eye opener for me. I then became an Epicurean because so much of what's in the Epicurus philosophy has nothing to do with. In fact, he famously said, "If I had a glass of water and a biscuit, I would be eating as well as Zeus."
Yes.
So fortunately, Thomas Jefferson was an Epicurean, and that whole idea of the pursuit of happiness that appears nowhere else on earth except the American whatever, written by Jefferson, is right out of Epicurus. So I don't have to give you a tip because you already know.
No, and I'm so excited having read The Swerve. I don't know if you've been following this, but in Pompeii, some of the things that were frozen in the ash were libraries,
right?
And they're starting to be able to uncode some of these scrolls with these cameras and with AI, and they think they may have a whole Epicurean library there that they've just discovered the first.
What a treasure!
Oh.
What a treasure that would be! My goodness.
Yeah, there could be we could have totally missed what Epicurus was actually about. We don't really have that much from him, but I'll tell you
But we have that poem. What's the Roman poem? De Natura.
Lucretius. Yeah, on the nature of things.
Yeah, we have that. That's what The Swerve was about. They found that poem, and that poet was the inspiration of Dante and all the great Roman writers.
I have a quote from Epicurus that I think you would love because it goes to what you were just saying. I ended one of my books with it. This is the last letter he wrote. He said, "On this happy day, which is the last day of my life, I write the following words to you." Just like to me, like Cicero would say that, to philosophize is to learn how to die. Epicurus seems to have done it very well. So we see him as this guy who's trying to avoid pain and love pleasure, but his brilliance was really his ability to find pleasure in ordinary, even painful situations.
Yes. No, I don't consider myself a Stoic, but I consider myself an Epicurean. But I'm a Stoic too, because, basically what I know, and what I don't know, I ignore.
The Roman poet Juvenal said that between the Stoics and the Epicureans, there was only a shirt. Like one of them wore a shirt, and the other lived a slightly harder life. But they were actually much more similar than we think.
I agree. Yeah, I certainly think so.
All right, so let's talk. Because you mentioned Shakespeare, Greenblatt wrote this amazing book called Will in the World. That's incredible, also. Yes. And he has a book called Tyrant, which I loved. But I was thinking, a common theme between this movie and then, of course, Apocalypse Now, but is also the theme of Shakespeare, is the ability to find old stories and then place them in a new context, but use the arcs and the characters and the morals. So talk to me about the job of an artist to sort of find and then reimagine old stories.
Well, for me to do that, I would have to bring in another giant into the picture, who is the German Goethe. And what Goethe said, and he was, of course, of big influence to our wonderful American Emerson. This game is a tag game. And Goethe's position was whatever he read and whatever he learned, it was only that which he could use in something that was important. And I believe that because, I have a pretty good memory. And I wasn't a big reader as a youngster, but as I became older, I started to read much more. And I had this habit of whatever I was working on, I would try to find something that was nothing like it so I could rest my brain. But what happened is when I would read something that was nothing like what I was working on, instead of it resting my brain, it made me want to change what I was working on to be more like what I was reading. And that kept happening because I would be choosing, I deliberately choose things that had nothing to do with what I was working on. For example, at one point I chose a great Chinese book that is well studied and loved in China, called the Story of the Stone, or The Dream of the Red Mansion, written in the 16th century. And I found myself trying to change Megalopolis into being more like that, which I did, because that was one of the few books I ever read that the dream life of the characters was as important as the waking. We all dream, and then we get back to what our life is. But who knows whether our life is the dream life and not the
Sure.
And in this Chinese novel, which is a beautiful book, The Dream of the Red Mansion, the dreams are part of the character's story, and so I made Megalopolis more like that. So I found that whatever it was that I was supposedly trying to get my mind off the movie, it was, in fact, I was bending my mind to make the movie more like that. And that happened a lot. And one of the reasons why the film is so unusual. But that was Goethe. Do you know anything about that whole period with Emerson in America? It was before the Civil War.
Yes.
They were called the Transcendentalists.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Well, they were interesting because they were men and women working together, which really, so the first time intellectually as partners, as intellectual partners. And they were, of course, the light of learning in those days was the Germans, was Goethe and all of those guys. And so they were all reading and translating Goethe into English. And Goethe's whole position was that what you read was only important as if you could make use of it, if you could put it in your work. And that's what I believe. Like, I believe that whatever I think is great in the cinema, which there's a lot that's great, it's, people ask you, what are your 10 favorite films? I said, ask me what my 1,000 favorite films, or who are the greatest filmmakers? What's your list of the top 10 great filmmakers? I say, I'll give you 500, that it's too abundant.
Sure.
And very exciting, our literature. If you look at literature as what you're able to take from,
yeah,
and be inspired by and copy even, I don't know who was it said. It says, poor artists borrow, great artists steal. I don't know who that was, someone, but that was what Goethe did.
Sure.
He wrote a book called, what the hell was that called? Wilhelm Meister, a German woman. And that was him stealing from Shakespeare.
Yeah.
That was Goethe saying, I want to be as much like Shakespeare as I can be.
When Shakespeare's stealing from Plutarch and from Montaigne and from these sort of Danish legends
and other plays, they were all stealing from each other. Marlowe and in fact, I think Stephen Greenblatt is writing a book on Kit. What's his name? Kit. Another playwright, very famous playwright, but that no one knows anything about. It wasn't Marlowe, it's someone else.
You see your movies and your thinking as products of all of that you have read and consumed and all the great stories and myths of history.
I certainly don't think it's something of mine. I am it was what it did to me. And I once read an obscure book by Balzac. I don't know where the hell I found it, in which someone's talking to Balzac and says to him, a lot of the young writers are just stealing your stuff. And Balzac said, that's why I wrote it. This is because if they take my stuff and make use of it, then I will be immortal in their work.
That's beautiful.
Balzac understood that this is a process that the young are inspired by the old, and then they become old and they inspire. And it's sort of like having a great-grandson or a great-great-great-grandson, is that you live through them. And artistically, what Balzac was saying and what Goethe says is that by taking and being inspired by these great artists of the past, who were probably inspired by a great artist, it all goes back to, Sappho and those kind of people, and Homer, whoever the hell he was or she was. They live through us. That's why when you tell me that they may have discovered more of Epicurus, I mean, imagine if someday we get lucky and discover more of Aeschylus or more of, so we have like 7 plays of Aeschylus, and he wrote 300.
I was just reading this book called Papyrus. I'm just so excited to tell you this. So I was just reading this book called Papyrus, which is about the history of paper and the early writings. And one of the things the woman is saying is that those scrolls, because they weren't books, so they weren't like books on a shelf, they were in these scrolls. And the boxes you would keep those scrolls in, she says most of them held 7 scrolls. And so the reason they think we only have like 7 plays from Aeschylus is that just a single box.
But imagine if somehow, somewhere with our technology, like with you mentioned imagine we find more Aeschylus or more Sophocles or more Euripides or more someone we never heard of. It's thrilling. It's so thrilling.
I mean, they discovered Gilgamesh like in the 1800s.
I love Gilgamesh.
Me too.
It's all about how the teenagers are not listening to their parents. Did you ever read that wonderful Persian book called Shahnameh by Ferdowsi?
No.
That's like Gilgamesh. It's an early Persian. It's great. The thing about these things like Gilgamesh is they're like 7,000 years old, but they're great reads, like Homer.
My son is 8, or he's turning 8, and he's obsessed with the Odyssey, and he loves all the jokes. And he's read comics about it, and he listens to music about it, and he's read these different translations together. And there's just something amazing about watching a young person get excited and lit up by the jokes that were passed down orally for thousands of years, and they still work. Like the timelessness of it is incredible.
I think Gilgamesh is a good example.
Yeah.
That also is like that. And this book, Shahnameh, the Persian, is called The Epic of Kings. It's another one like that. They're great reads.
Yeah, the Bhagavad Gita is, of course, is another one. Just these myths, and yet to think that we have thousands of years of continual use and discussion in Western civilization of the Odyssey. So it's so much more familiar with us. But to think we've only had like 150 years of Gilgamesh because it was lost for so long.
Right.
It doesn't have the same cultural prominence, but that doesn't mean it's not as brilliant and it doesn't teach the same lessons.
That's true. Are you familiar at all or interested in Sanskrit and ancient Indian myth?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of a woman named Wendy Doniger?
No.
She's the pretty much world's expert on that subject, a woman. The first girl I ever kissed. I was not the first boy she ever kissed. I was 17, she was 16, but she went on to become this I still know her. She's a great brilliant lady.
I've been reading a lot about T.E. Lawrence lately and sort of Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes.
And just the epicness of that life, sort of feeling like it was plucked like he talks about in the intro, his intro in the Odyssey, he says, like, to be able to translate the Odyssey, you have to be able to have killed people, and you have to have fought lions and been attacked by pirates, and just the sort of tradition of the epic stories that we have is just such an incredible thing.
What's the name of the woman of that time who was around with all those guys? There's a famous English woman who was there with Lawrence.
Yes, Gertrude Bell, I think.
Yeah, I think it's Gertrude Bell.
Yeah.
She was another figure. Alec Guinness in Lawrence of Arabia played Faisal II.
Yeah.
And Faisal II was a great, great, great man. And I think Gertrude Bell knows what happened to him because he vanished very mysteriously, Faisal II.
I was fascinated. I had no idea that basically after he becomes the most famous man in the world, he just enlists in the British Air Force. And he's a mechanic for like 10 years.
Amazing.
And like the fame sort of breaks him, but he decides just to do manual labor as a way to kind of reset himself. His life is itself almost a kind of a Greek myth.
Well, there are some extraordinary human beings that, I've had the pleasure of, I'm so old now because you're obviously a young man, but I'm so old. I actually met some of these people, I met... Well, one of the most extraordinary people I ever met, I know he's an actor and everything, is Marlon Brando. He was a one of a kind. And some of the Kurosawa, I met some really great people. And I know Stephen Greenblatt. He's a wonderful man.
Who else like that stands out to you? Like, so the people that your life intersected with that you can hardly believe?
I met Marcel Duchamp when I was 16.
Wow.
He was fascinating. Some other figures were less famous. A man named Fred Coe, who was an early founder of television drama, Fred Coe. Of course, a lot of filmmakers like Jean Renoir and Billy Wilder and people like Jack Warner and Daryl Zanuck and Samuel Goldwyn, some of those people.
Did you ever meet F. Scott Fitzgerald?
I never did, no. And the authors, let me see, who did I ever meet? I'm in love with Edith Wharton. I have a big painting of her, but I went to her house in Connecticut. She was one of the greats. In literature, I'm trying to think.
This is probably interesting only to me, but did you ever meet John Fonte?
Yes, very well.
Ooh.
He was a wonderful man. He's
my favorite.
Well, did you ever see that beautiful film with Nick Conti and about is it Billie Holiday or someone where he's building his father? He's a writer and his father is a bricklayer and comes
Full of Life.
Full of Life.
Yes.
Yeah, I knew John Fonte. He was a nice man.
Wow. I think Ask the Dust is maybe my second favorite novel.
That's a beautiful book. Yeah, and you know who knew him? He just passed away. Robert Town. You know who Robert Town is?
Yes,
he was great.
He found like that. I think that's one of the most incredible stories in all of literature. That there's a copy of Ask the Dust in the Los Angeles Public Library, and both Towns and Charles Bukowski stumble upon it, and they rediscover this book that was basically lost because Hitler had bankrupted his publisher.
Right. Interesting. No, I love that movie. I love Full of Life, and we bought the rights for Ask the Dusk, and Bob Town was very much. I have a big brother syndrome. I had a brother who was 5 years older than me. He was wonderful older brother. He wrote stories, and whatever he was, I wanted to be the junior version of. So he wrote stories under the name August Floyd Coppola. So when I copied him and tried to write stories, I would use my middle name the same way, Francis Ford Coppola. So The Godfather became such a success that I became so suddenly famous that he couldn't be August Floyd Coppola anymore because it looked like he was imitating me, but I was imitating him. And all my life I looked for those older brothers
who
could guide me, and that was a role that Bob Town so kindly helped me so much. When I made The Godfather, everyone hated the movie. No one said a good thing about it. And the first person who told me that there was something to it was Bob Town.
Wow.
And he said, there's one thing that you can do to make it better. And I said, what is that? He said, there should be a scene in The Godfather between Brando and Pacino, father and son. I said, well, that doesn't exist in the book. Could you write it? And he said, I'll write it for you. And he wrote that scene.
Wow.
Bob Town.
My other favorite Hollywood novelist, and maybe you know this person too, so I'm just nerding out here. I love Bud Schulberg too. What Makes Sammy Run is incredible, but I love The Harder They Fall is, I think, his best one. And then he wrote one about his time with Fitzgerald also that's amazing.
The Disenchanted. I wrote a screenplay, a very unusual screenplay for The Disenchanted, which he loved.
No, really.
And I told the story not in flashbacks, but in flash forwards, which was that was very unusual. I wish I had that script. I don't have it.
I do too.
But Bud Schulberg liked it.
Well, this brings us full circle because Marcus Aurelius makes a brief appearance at the end of that book. I think it says something like, and then he was ceased to be whirled about as the Fitzgerald character dies. He is ceased to be whirled about. So this sort of through line of the Stoic philosophy brings us full circle here.
Well, as I think everything does. I've had an interesting experience, as I told you, that I always am looking up. Even now, I'm writing. You know what I'm reading right now?
No,
I'm maybe a third into it. Tender is the Night.
Ooh, what do you think?
Well, it's beautiful writing. I'm trying to. There's a little bit of a controversy because I'm told that there are two versions of Tender is the Night, that it wasn't successful at first. So he and his editor straightened out something. I guess I don't know which version I have, but I think what's unusual is that in the original Tender is the Night, there's a huge flashback in the middle of it that goes back and tells the story of Nicole and Dick Diver. And I don't know what's going to happen. And maybe I don't know which one I have.
Yeah.
Have you read Tender is the Night?
I have. I read it in high school, but I don't remember which one I read.
Well, that's the thing. I hate it when the publisher changes it because then you don't know which one to read. But I'm going to get to them. But I have a funny thing that'll make you laugh. Is that so? Usually when I'm reading a book. And I'm finished with Megalops now, so what I'm reading is not going to change it because it's going to be shown. But I am, as an 85-year-old and as a man who wonders whether or not I'm really some sort of solipsist movie director whose life is the movie he's making, because when I was young and I made The Godfather, everyone, critics and stuff, said, "Oh, he's like Michael Corleone, this director. He's conniving and he's silently taking over." Then I made Apocalypse Now, and they said, "Well, he's a megalomaniac. He's making this. He's Kurtz. He's like Brando." And then I made a movie called Gardens of Stone about Jimmy Caan as an officer who befriends a young cadet in the squad that buries the dead and loses his son. And while I was shooting the movie, I lost my son. And I really remember thinking, my God, am I cursed? I have to live every movie that I'm making. I'm making a movie about a guy who loses his son. Do I have to lose my son? This is too weird, And recently, I sort of came back to wondering as I approach, as my family in Italian says, vicino a morte, which means the vicinity of death. This is the age when you start to be in your middle 80s and used to be in your 70s. Now it's getting later. And I begin to wonder, I said, gee, maybe I'm a sort of solipsist movie director. And, I lost my wife recently who I loved dearly. And what about love? Who are these people I love? Well, maybe they're aspects of myself. They're characters in this movie I'm making about myself. And perhaps I'm we all know that it's better to write the story from the ending the other direction, because you don't understand, like when you're a kid, and many philosophers like Kierkegaard and others have said that, we live our life from young to old, but you can only understand it if you look at it from old to young. and I just said, well, so I put into Google, what's a book I can read that can make me understand my life as a solipsist? And I got an answer. And it was, you know who Charlie Kaufman is?
Yeah.
He's this wonderful, crazy screenwriter.
Sure.
He wrote a novel called Antkind, a 700-800 page book called Antkind. And that's what Google said, if you want to read something about being So I got it. And damned if as I said, everything I read changes my movie, but this book is changing my life, because so I finished it after 750 pages. And it was not unsatisfying, and the ending was sort of interesting. And I don't suggest to read it, although it's hilarious, because it's a long read. but that's my latest experience is reading this crazy Charlie Kaufman novel.
I love that. And speaking of books, just because I know he's a through line in the movie, one of the characters quotes him a few times. What's your relationship with Marcus Aurelius's Meditations?
Well, I have. He's quoted a number of times in the movie. There's. I wrote down every time there's a beautiful scene where a father and daughter, sort of the Cicero scene, and she says at first, it is the responsibility of leadership to work intelligently with what is given and not waste time fantasizing about a world of flawless people and perfect choices. And that's sort of appropriate for the Cataline character, who's a futurist.
Yeah.
And then she looks to her father and she says, the object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding yourself in the ranks of the insane, which is very appropriate for today.
Yes.
And then she kisses him and she says, finally, the universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it, which is Marcus Aurelius, the great Marcus Aurelius. What a great emperor Rome had.
Yes. The only philosopher king.
And what a terrible son he had.
Yes. Yeah, you could argue that Joaquin Phoenix's Commodus is maybe too generous. Like he was actually worse.
He was worse. He was worse than Caligula.
Yeah. How does that?
If anyone could be worse than Caligula or Nero.
Yes. I'm fascinated with that. How does such a great man raise such a terrible son?
Well, it comes down to how many wives did he have? Who was Commodus's mother?
Faustina. Marcus only had one wife, and they were pretty. We're told he loves her deeply. There's some rumors that she's unfaithful, but we're told he loves her deeply. The problem, I think, is Marcus Aurelius buries 6 of his 11 children, which I don't know how a family could possibly withstand that kind of tragedy.
In the old days, a generation before us, people usually had 6, 7, 8 kids, and they lost 2.
Yeah.
And I lost 1 son, and I tell you, it's a sentence of 30 years before the first thing you think in the morning, did it happen? Did it really happen? And it's only after 30 years that it wasn't the first horrible thought I had in the morning.
Wow.
It made me think of that great Aeschylus quote. There's an Aeschylus quote about how the pain drips on you drop by drop until by the awful grace of God, it took me 30 years for the horror of realizing I lost my son to not be the first thing I thought of in the morning.
I've sort of thought that when people say Marcus Aurelius's writing is depressing, I think that this guy got out of bed at all in the morning after the tragedy and death and pain that he felt. Actually, he must have been the most hopeful, optimistic person who ever lived.
I don't find, I found that there's a Marcus Aurelius quote. I'm sure you know it. I don't want to look at it, but I lost this wife of 60 years, and
I'm so sorry.
it's sort of devastating. But there was a Marcus Aurelius quote that really lifted me, which was if you lose, I don't know it literally, but you'll know it. If you lose a loved one, honor her, and in a sense try to be more like her, and then she'll live in your actions. And so my wife was very good, and I just try to be like her. And when I try to be like her, I like she was very, if someone was alone or sick or something, she'd call them up and be comforting to them. And I'm not like that. So I started to do that. People that I know, some guys my age who have no grandchildren, are just there, and call them up and say, how are you? And being like her.
Yeah.
And they were so pleased and said, oh, it's so kind. And so I keep my wife in my life with Marcus Aurelius' advice by trying to be more like her.
I find that absolutely beautiful. Oh man, that's
it is.
That Aeschylus quote you just mentioned. I was just writing about this last week, because did you know that the night that RFK found out that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, he was giving a speech in Indianapolis in a black neighborhood, and he could feel a riot coming on. And he quoted that speech to them, and he spoke about his own loss of his brother. And that was one of the few cities in America that didn't riot. And so again, these ideas from the classics coming right back to modern life and being of use. It's such an incredibly wonderful and important tradition, I think.
Well, someone sent me that quote when I lost my son, and it was the only quote that I understood emotionally, that ultimately it drops on you drop by drop, until by the awful grace of God comes wisdom or something, whatever came.
Yeah, I think before that, Sophocles or Aeschylus says, we suffer unto truth. That's the only way that we learn the important things about life and about existence.
We suffer into truth. How beautiful. Well, the loss of a child is not something I would wish on my worst enemy. In fact, I don't even have any enemy. I find everyone in my life who maybe did me wrong had reasons in their story to do it. So the only person it's tough to forgive is yourself.
Mm-hmm.
How many years have you been married?
I have been married for, let's see, I think we're approaching 10, but I've been with my wife for 20 years. We met in college when we were 19 years old.
Oh, how wonderful. Well, I hope in my movie they ask in the story, she says to the character, of all the institutions your utopia wants to preserve, which is the most important to you? And he says marriage.
Wow.
Marriage is going to change because everything around it is changing, but I do hope we can preserve it, because there's something so more beautiful about it than meets the eye at first glance.
What's funny, I had first read Marcus Aurelius in college a few weeks before I'd met my wife. And I remember we were on our first date, and I was telling her about this book that I'd read. We were talking about it. And so many years later, I go to the shelf to pull down a copy of Meditations. I was going to get something out of it. And I found a receipt inside. And I learned in that moment that my wife had went and bought herself a copy from Barnes & Noble, like a few days after we had met.
How wonderful.
Yeah.
I have a beautiful set. You know what I own here? I can show it to you. It's right there. I have the Loeb Library.
Oh, all the little green and red and blue ones?
The whole thing.
Ooh.
The whole thing. The whole wall is covered with it. I only wish I could read either Latin or Greek, because everything I have is in Latin and Greek. I have the whole thing.
Yeah, every other page, right? One page is English and then one page is the original. Those are just beautiful little books.
Yeah, it's a great publication. I have the whole thing. I'm very proud of it. I wish I could read it.
Francis, this has been the treat of a lifetime for me. I have one kind of last question for you. This might be a big one, but I'm curious Okay. You basically make this enormous bet at this point in your life and career. You go all in on this idea, which you've been working on for something like 40 years. How does an artist know that this is the thing and they haven't lost their mind, right? Like, I imagine there must have been moments where you doubted yourself, or you thought, this isn't going to work, it's too hard. How does an artist know what is the big swing that they have to take, and then what is a field too far?
Well, you don't know, but it just for me, I'm more interested. If you said to me, "What do you want? You want $1,000, or you want 1,000,000, or you want 1,000 friends?" I'll say, "I want the friends." I don't value money. There's too many times in history where people had buckets of money and couldn't buy a loaf of bread, yet there was a friend who said, "I'll give you half of my bread."
Sure.
And I believe that we are all one family together, and I don't think in the future there's going to be money. I think it's going to be us doing things for each other that give us pleasure, and I mean, also I realize, the biggest gamble I took was Apocalypse Now, because I was on the hook for it, and interest was over 20%. And people are still seeing Apocalypse Now. And I feel pretty confident that no matter what happens, people are going to be going to see Megalopolis for the next 40 years. And maybe a period where it's an apparent disaster. But over time, I once read an article that James Joyce was talking about Finnegan's Wake. And he said, "I'm going to put so much interesting stuff in this that it's going to take 50 years for people to figure out what's in it, and it'll sell the whole time." It's sort of like that. If you make a work, I believe that Megalopolis is rich in what's in it, and that people will see it again. And it's not boring.
Yeah.
It's not like most people who see it or don't like it. If you say, "You want to see it again tomorrow?" they say, "Yeah." Because it's never boring, and there's always something new, like Apocalypse was. So, I feel sanguine. I didn't make it to make money. I made it for people to change how they feel about one another, and the real. There are a lot of things that are never said publicly. I asked Stephen Greenblatt. I said, "Has any philosopher ever said the human being is a genius species? The human being is beyond, by light years, any other intelligent creature we know?" He said, "Well, there was one guy named Miranda Pico de la Miranda who wrote something called The Origins of Man, but he got put in prison for it. And he had to get out, he had to say that, yes, the human being is an incomparable genius, but God made him so that someone could appreciate how great God was." And that's how they got. But he died at 39. Did you ever hear of him?
No.
Miranda de la Pica, his name is. And he's the only one who's ever said what this movie says. This movie comes right out and says it to your face. The human being is beyond a creature that is beyond being admired. It should be, we are great. What we can do is great. There's no problem on this earth that we can't solve, that if we just could employ our gifts to it. And I believe that to be what other creature can do what we do?
No.
I'm sitting here on a stupid device talking to you, where God knows where you are. I get to feel I know you. And we made this thing. We primates crawling around in the jungle. How do we do it? We are geniuses, and we are one family. That's what I feel, and that's what Megalopolis basically says.
Well, I respect and I appreciate the bet. My friend, the filmmaker Casey Neistat, said to me once, "Look, if all we cared about was money, we would have gone into advertising." And he said, "You have to remember, you don't make work to make money. You make money to make more work." And that's kind of how I think if you're not going to go all your chips in on something you cared about, what was the point of accumulating all the chips in the first place?
Totally, and it's not. Those chips are nothing. My real chips are my children, and what we're talking about is whether or not there's going to be a habitable world for them. I have a great grandson. He's 15 months old. What kind of world is he going to live in? If we're gonna destroy it in front of our eyes, I don't know. My dream is that this movie, every Thanksgiving, people are going to see. Every New Year's, people are going to see Megalopolis, and at the end of seeing it, instead of after saying, "Well, I've decided I'm giving up smoking, or I'm going to lose weight, or I'm going to behave better," and I want them instead to say, "Is the society where we're living in the only one available to us, and what can we do to make it better?" And every Thanksgiving, that's going to be the conversation. And that would be utopia, because if we had that conversation, we would make it wonderful.
That's a lovely idea, and I hope that happens also. Francis, thank you so much. This has been incredible.
Well, it's a great pleasure to meet you. And where you said where are you based? I forgot. You're
right outside Austin, Texas.
Please, if you go to the
Mexican restaurant,
send me a note if you liked it.
I will. I'll go.
Do you know Richard Linklater or Roberto Rodriguez?
I know Richard a little bit. We both live in the same little town here. He's the original in this town of Bastrop, Texas. But I have a little bookstore and everything here in the little town.
They're both wonderful people.
I'll tell him you said hello.
Okay, bye-bye. Nice to meet you.
All right. See ya.
Bye-bye.